Let's head to Kenya, where more than 1,000 entrepreneurs from across Africa are meeting to address challenges to growth and opportunities on the continent. The annual Sankalp Africa Summit is also addressing the role of entrepreneurs in ensuring sustainable development goals, making sure that they are achieved. And delegates at the summit will also review the potential of cutting-edge tech innovation to leapfrog African ventures. The forum, which is an initiative of Intellecap Advisory, has raised about $25 million to build businesses across the globe. African entrepreneurs attending the summit are expected to build networks with international investors to expand their businesses. Well, joining us in the studio is Agustin Ndungu. He's a manager at the Sankalp Forum. Thank you so much for joining us here in the studio. Now, we certainly know that African entrepreneurs face some of the toughest challenges globally. We know your forum is looking at solving some of those issues, including looking at how cutting-edge innovation will help these African entrepreneurs. So shed more light on the discussions that took place today.
Sure, thank you, and glad to be here. So part of the discussions actually looked at these challenges and from a view of what needs to be done in order to actually get the continent from the stage where we are looking at the challenges to growing a business and instead focus on the opportunities that are here. The first level is we need to shift our thinking around the continent. These challenges are the same ones that make it very exciting for investors. In fact, we found that investors are much more keen to continue building their presence on the continent. The challenges that are going to continue being basically seen on the continent are, one, access to information for entrepreneurs, and that's the role that technology will play in solving. There's need for a lot more collaboration than we've seen so far, particularly between governments, private sector, and the traditionally non-profit organizations that have not been involved as much with entrepreneurs. So collaboration, technology, and finally innovative financing to enable entrepreneurs to get access to capital.
Well, let's talk a little bit more about this innovative financing. When you ask any entrepreneur on the continent, what's their biggest challenge? Access to finance. So certainly tell me, what actionable solutions did you discuss? And tell me a little bit more about the role that innovative financing can play to help them solve this issue.
Sure. So one thing about innovative financing is that it's actually a different way of thinking about financing. The challenge that entrepreneurs will share with regards to access to finance is they will go to a bank and they will be asked for either security or they'll have hefty interest payments to make, which will make it much harder for them to grow their own business, and instead they will be focusing on repaying the loan. What we are seeing is that there are different institutions that are coming into this space to fill in the gap for what you would call access to capital anyway for the entrepreneurs. One, we have traditionally NGOs that have funded community-based organizations or international donors that then fund the NGOs. They've also looked at the space and they've seen they can deploy the same capital, what you're calling philanthropic capital or venture philanthropy, and deploying it to entrepreneurs who are building businesses that serve communities. So you don't have to have that basically differentiation that was important maybe 10 years back between what an NGO would do and a business would do. We've also seen, for example, faith-based organizations, Catholic Relief Services, who are here with us for the last 2 days. And they are also looking at how can faith-based institutions get involved in supporting entrepreneurs for the same reason, that the entrepreneurs are embedded in the communities, they're solving problems that the communities have, and so it's actually a misnomer when we say that you're a non-profit organization. Profit really becomes an enabler for these businesses to scale, rather than money that is going to someone's pocket. So innovative financing is looking at different institutions that are deploying capital to entrepreneurs, and it also looks at the different tools that we can use to do the deployment. And a lot of the issues that are coming in include how to evaluate the impact of the businesses, which is where we found that we need to actually do a lot more work around that. We also need to do a lot of work around the policy environment, so that environment of basically innovative financing does not face the same challenges that you would say the traditional lending industry has faced.
Now, shifting focus just slightly, you also discussed how entrepreneurs can help in achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. How?
Sure. Actually, the summit discussed how we cannot achieve the Sustainable Development Goals if we don't put the entrepreneurs at the center or at the driving seat of these goals. In fact, we took a step back to understand why do we have the Sustainable Development Goals. Many of us will remember the Millennium Development Goals, which are the precedent to the SDGs. And for the vast majority of the African continent, MDGs really never got fulfilled as we were expected to do. So one major difference is we cannot think of SDGs as different from the Millennium Development Goals. It's just a new way of looking at the ambitions that we have for development on the continent and really around the world. So when we already take that perspective that we have to rethink these development objectives or development goals, then the first thing we find is that to actually think of new solutions, we have to work with innovators, we have to work with entrepreneurs. And so entrepreneurs are at the center, or have to be at the center of the Sustainable Development Goals, which is the only shot that we have as a continent to actually making a better dent on the SDGs than we did with the Millennium Development Goals.
Right. Now, you also did launch a report on Africa in 2030. It's looking at the key shifts expected in the different sectors. Give us the highlights and some of those findings.
Sure. When we talk about innovative technology, we are looking at things like AI, artificial intelligence. We're talking about robotics. We're talking about blockchain technology, Bitcoin. And we found that there are two trends that are happening on the continent. One is the continent is actually looking to the rest of the world to see what kinds of technologies are going to be relevant for the continent, and trying to figure out which new ways are these technologies that already exist, they're going to be deployed on the continent. And then on the second hand, we are looking at new technologies that are absolutely new to the world, and they're coming from the continent. And one of the most exciting highlights was to look at, for example, the solar space in terms of off-grid communities, right? So there's a challenge for the continent that traditional basically grid lighting solutions haven't been deployed as much because of capital limitations. And therefore, we've seen the continent basically taking steps towards leapfrogging what you'd say is the traditional grid infrastructure and into areas of solar lighting, for example, that is being deployed into schools, into homes, and enabling outcomes in education, in health, without having to go through the expensive route of investments in infrastructure. So we're looking at basically what will be relevant for the continent, and we're also looking at what we can encourage innovators across the continent to come up with innovations that do not necessarily fit the rest of the world, but they are going to be critical for the continent.
Right. Now, talking to you, there are certainly opportunities. But given the current economic, global economic realities, have you seen investor interest, investor funds from outside sort of waning?
Actually not waning. Surprisingly, the interest for investors on the continent continues to grow. We've seen a lot of shifts in the global economy for sure, but what they've meant is that investors are looking at new areas that are going to continue to sustain, despite the risk, they're going to continue to sustain returns over the long term or the medium to the long term. And emerging markets, what now for Africa we are talking about growth economies, not just emerging economies, provide that opportunity. For investors who have raised money in the global markets targeted at Africa, success has actually been quite a number of, I would say, for example, one of the partners we had on the table, a Barrage Group, which has raised $1 billion for Africa, and that was actually oversubscribed. We've seen Kenya raise Eurobond, which was also oversubscribed 4 times. Nigeria just released their own Eurobond, and that was also oversubscribed 8 times. So investors are excited to focus on Africa, and we find that this is going to continue in the short term, but also in the long run.
Well, many thanks for coming into the studio and
Good to
giving
be
us
here.
that update. Of course, that's Agustin Ndungu. He's a manager at Sankalp Forum. Now.